what we used to think of as a bank bail-in, where they take your deposit in order to support a failing bank. Well, that is now spread across the entire financial economy, where whatever you have in an account anywhere can just disappear because they're going to transfer ownership of it to these big dominant entities out there in the financial system that need those assets in order to keep from blowing up.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for January 22nd through January 29th, 2024, while supplies last. First, we feature pre-1933 gold $10 and $20 Liberties at $89 over melt and $139 over melt, respectively. Next, backdated 1-ounce silver maples are at $3.75 over spot with a minimum order of 50. We also have backdated quarter-ounce gold maples at $59 over melt when you purchase 2 or more. And finally, backdated 1/10-ounce gold maples are just $32.50 over melt with your purchase of 4 or more coins. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We are always glad to have this returning guest who's followed widely on his new Substack channel. John Rubino, the former founder of DollarCollapse.com, is now the proud owner of a Substack. He's going to tell us about that, where he writes extensively on a variety of topics that I think are very interesting, and I imagine you will as well. John, thanks for coming back on Liberty and Finance.
Hey, Dunnigan, good to talk to you again.
I should mention you're joining us this Wednesday, January 24th, 2024. Glad to have you back on. A lot of things to talk about. One of the things I want to talk with you about is some of your recent research and writings on what you call Recession Watch. There's a bit of a lively debate among our followers and our subscribers about whether we're already in a depression or already in a undeclared recession, etc. But you've been watching a lot of indicators to help people understand the true state of things. Even if we're dealing with flawed government statistics, at least we can keep an eye on things and see the direction that things are heading. And people can correlate that with their gut feeling and their anecdotal impressions as they drive around their own communities, that sort of thing. What are you watching in your aptly named Recession Watch?
Well, it's funny about that. That was a monthly series on Substack. But lately, so many negative indicators have been coming in that I had to post a new one just 10 days after the previous one, to keep everything from being stale, And there are just basically everywhere you look, there are signs that we're heading into a recession. There's something called the Index of Leading Economic Indicators that is plunging, and the inverted yield curve sends a lagged indicator. In other words, when the yield curve inverts, a year later you get a recession. Well, it's been a year since the yield curve inverted. And so that's now flashing recession. And it goes on and on. There are all kinds of inside baseball things that are pointing to a downturn in 2024, and which, frankly, kind of pointed to a downturn 3 months ago, too. So like you said, it could be that they're going to go back and date the start of the coming recession in like October of 2023, which they tend to do. They tend to, after you drop into a recession, they go back and say, oh, it really started way back there. So that could be why we're seeing all these indicators point towards a slowing economy, because we're really getting one. But there's one thing that is very different this time, because normally you see the Fed tighten towards the end of a cycle, and that slows down business and borrowing and everything and pitches the economy into a recession. And the Fed absolutely did tighten this time around, as aggressively in such a short time as they've ever tightened before. But the federal government decided to counteract that by running massive deficits. So now we've got this thing that economists call fiscal dominance, which is another word for massive deficits that don't make any sense otherwise. So we've got the economy being held up by the government taking on massive amounts of new debt. In other words, borrowing huge amounts of new money.
Just to clarify, when you say held up, you mean propped up?
Propped up. Yeah, sorry. In other words, we aren't tipping into a recession the way you would think we would be with money as tight as it has gotten lately. And the reason for that is that fiscal policy is extremely easy, really shockingly easy. When you think of a 1.5 to $2 trillion a year deficit, that's crisis level borrowing, right? That's the thing you do when you're existentially threatened by a war or a pandemic or another depression, like in 2008, 2009, when we were literally afraid of the 1930s coming back. So we ran these massive deficits back then, and people kind of agreed that it was needed. But now it's not clear why it's happening. One explanation is that the interest costs that the government has to pay on its debt has gone through the roof. It's gone parabolic, basically just straight up, because interest rates went up so quickly. And so that's 1 trillion of the current $1.5 trillion deficit. And there's really no end in sight to that, right? Because so much more government debt has to roll over at today's higher rates that the interest costs of the government, in other words, the amount of interest that they're paying on their debt that's going out into the financial system, can't do anything but rise. So we've got these big, giant deficits going forward in a non-crisis environment, which is kind of new. It's not the kind of thing that you normally do, unless you assume that everything is a crisis now because we've taken on so much debt that we can't function without massive amounts of new credit in the system. And I kind of tend to think that, whether the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve are looking at it that way, I kind of tend to think that that's where we are, in reality, because we've borrowed so much money that we can never again go back to across the board tight money. For instance, at the peak of a normal cycle, the government is running much smaller deficits because more and more people are paying taxes, and the Fed is tightening. So you got tight money from the central bank and relatively tight money from the federal government. Not the case this time. We've got massively easy money coming from the federal government with no end in sight. So, new experiment. We haven't tried it in the past. It probably is going to blow up in our faces, but we have to see because it's uncharted territory.
When you, that new term fiscal dominance, it's just, I don't know whether it's ludicrous or chilling or all of the above. When you see new terms having to become coined, new terms having to be twisted to get us to kind of calm down instead of reacting as we appropriately should to a clear and present danger. In other words, they were telling us before, don't worry, the economy is strong. Then they said, don't worry, the consumer is strong, even if the economy is faltering. Now they're saying, well, at least the government's strong, which means, what does that mean? The government doesn't have anything. The government has nothing. All they have is debt. So all they can do is steal from us in the future, our children and grandchildren, and try to placate the now. It's seems like a word twisting to try to allay fears when perhaps urgent action is what's needed, not what's being done.
Yeah, and it's possible that a lot of people still don't understand what you described because a significant part of the populace, along with a lot of economists, seem to think this is fine, that the government running $2 trillion a year deficits is just okay because it creates a few new jobs, and that's a very Keynesian way of thinking about the economy, where it doesn't matter how much debt you take on as long as aggregate demand, in other words, how much we spend each year to buy stuff, goes up by 3% each year. So the amount of debt that you take on really doesn't matter in that analytical framework. And that's the dominant analytical framework out there in the economy and in academia and in the mainstream media. But you're right. When governments borrow money, that's not free. They get it back in two ways, or they steal in two ways. One is that our children and grandchildren have to pay the interest on the debt sometime in the future. And the other is that it's inflationary. It makes the dollar lose value faster than it otherwise would, which comes out of the savings of individuals who trust the government. In other words, if you have a bank account or you've got some cash under the mattress or whatever, in any kind of form that depends on the value of the dollar, you are basically harvested in order for the rich to get richer. And I don't think that's something people completely understand yet, but I think more people are coming to that conclusion, which is why populism is becoming a bigger political force around the world. In other words, Donald Trump can trace his political ascendancy back to this idea that people are figuring out that the government is screwing us over. And anybody who promises to get back what's been stolen from us has a good chance of getting our vote, and so I think that might be the limiting factor in all of this, that you can't politically get away with this forever. And we're reaching a point around the world where the scams that governments are running are increasingly getting them voted out of office and replaced by people who actively campaign against those scams. So it's one good thing that's coming from this. It's not going to be a pleasant process, but at least it's heading in the right direction politically, if not financially.
It's interesting because about a week ago, we interviewed Andy Schekman from Miles Franklin, and he read directly out of the text of the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act, where it's explicitly explains that not only are you not insured beyond the $250,000 FDIC limit, and that's money you've just loaned out of the goodness of your heart to the bank to do with whatever they will, and good luck as an unsecured creditor. But secondly, that even those who are insured may have to wait 3 to 5 years to get reimbursed, depending on the situation and how that process unravels. So that's another thing as far as the truth not being understood by the mass of people, that as far as what do they really own, and they think they own deposits in the bank, but they don't. And secondly, the book The Great Taking that just came out a few months ago, it's available free online. We'll put a link to it in the description of this video. You've been looking into that as well, because people are also concerned about, even though the stock market seems to have had another amazing life after death recovery here and is still bumping along near all-time highs, people are wondering, do I really own anything that's in my brokerage account? If I'm carrying a cash balance in my stock brokerage account, or if I have money market funds in my stock brokerage account, heaven forbid, even owning stocks, that sort of thing outright, do I really own any of that if push comes to shove? And you've been looking into that, and the book The Great Taking does an examination of that. What's your view of that, and for those who haven't been following that?
Well, I've been doing secondary research on The Great Taking, which is to say that I've been reading the analysis of other smart people and seeing what they seem to think about it. And so far, a lot of guys that I respect who are, objectively a lot smarter than I am, seem to think that it's for real, that the law has actually been changed in a way that allows, what we used to think of as a bank bail-in, where they take your deposit in order to support a failing bank. Well, that is now spread across the entire financial economy, where whatever you have in an account anywhere can just disappear because they're going to transfer ownership of it to these big dominant entities out there in the financial system that need those assets in order to keep from blowing up. So, that the Great Taking is a pretty apt term for what they're talking about. And if it's true, then it extends a lot of people's fears from bank bail-ins to basically everything, and confiscation of this and the evaporation of that. And so two things about that. One is that it's a recipe for a civil war, because it's basically going to be baby boomers who get stolen from in that kind of a scenario, because we own most of the financial assets. Generationally, it won't be the millennials who suffer very much from this, because they don't have that many, for instance, stocks in brokerage accounts, but it's going to be the boomers. And we won't take this line down. One thing I've noticed lately is that most of my boomer friends are pretty well armed. It's just late in life, it seems to be that guys accumulate weapons. I literally think we would have we would have a civil war if they tried to do this. But that doesn't mean they won't do it, because they've been softening us up with the pandemic and a lot of the financial stuff that's been going on, as a way of seeing what they can get away with. And they found out that a significant part of the population can be cowed into obedience if you tell them there's a crisis. So, the government's pitch might be, look, it's absolute chaos and civil war and martial law, unless we're able to do these financial things that we need to do, and we'll make it all up to you. Don't you worry, we're going to take care of you. But for now, you don't have access to your brokerage accounts, or something like that. And it looks like 50% of the population is going to buy that. But the question is, what will the other 50% of the population do? Because I think we really kind of bifurcated in the last few years, where a lot of people decided to double down on their trust for the government, and a lot of people saw their mistrust of the establishment grow to epic proportions. Now, there are millions of people out there who are never going to take another vaccination, and maybe not even let their kids or grandkids get vaccinated, and who are stacking and buying guns. There's the whole spectrum of prepping behaviors. I think we're turbocharged by what has happened in the last few years. So we've kind of got these two populations out there. One will put up with something like the Great Taking, and one will not, and it's going to be fascinating to see how it goes. And obviously, you and I are pulling from the group that will not take this lying down. So I hope we're not gearing up for a civil war, but the financial system is going to break. The collateral that's out there in the form of financial assets is completely inadequate to cover the debts that right now cover those things that have been placed against the world's financial assets. So something is going to happen where that debt has to be wiped out, either by inflation or by default. And then the pain has to be allocated somehow. So it's going to be really unpleasant when it happens. And it's just a question of how are we set up politically to allocate the pain? Because, we have examples from the 2008-2009 era where the vast majority of countries allocated the pain to regular people and bailed out the bankers, right? But a handful of places did it the opposite way, like Iceland, for instance, let their bankers go broke and they put them in jail, and they bailed out bank depositors and made them whole instantly. There was no delay, and there was no messing around with, you'll get it, or you'll get these depreciated pieces of currency at some point in the indefinite future. They just made the depositors whole, and they didn't cut the bankers any slack. So we've got that model out there, and that's the way it could go if we're a lot wiser than it looks like we are, So we have that possibility, but we'll have to see, Big things are coming. And the Great Taking is kind of a signpost on the way. It's something that is letting us know one possibility out there that we need to be on the lookout for.
One aspect that you touched on that I think is worthy of restating is that in this coming time of taking and pain allocating and so on, there's also a strategy that was absolutely deployed over the past 3 or 4 years. That is fragmenting the population into subgroups. You were describing one group will do this and one group will do that, but there's more to it than that. The group that is standing up for constitutional rights and for private property rights and for self-defense and for limited government, et cetera, is officially vilified, is officially labeled as insurrectionists and hoarders and all kinds of nasty names, to continue to create, to basically cast basically tension between groups of the people. And we've discussed this before. You've talked about that is from time immemorial a tool of aristocracy to keep the rabble from becoming effective at overturning the unjust tables of a layered society that is unjust. Your thoughts on what can be done? What can we do to not buy into that, and to counter that, and to resist that temptation of regimes to pit us against each other?
Yeah, it's very important to understand that when gay and straight people go after each other, or black and white, or name the or pro and anti-abortion people, name the social battle we've got going on right now. And sitting above it is an aristocracy that's smiling. They love it when the peasants fight over issues that don't involve the rich stealing from the poor, because the last thing they want is for a working class rebellion kind of thing to happen, where the 40% of the population that's actively being ripped off gets together and sees that they have a common enemy, so they put aside their arguments over what's taught in junior high right now or whatever, and then they go to the castle with their pitchforks and they change things in that way. The aristocracy would hate that, and for instance, the old version of leftism, the Bernie Sanders kind of socialism / liberalism, was very class-based. And it said, black and white, gay and straight, we're all working people, and we need to, have strong unions, and we need to be able to make sure that tax policy and monetary policy and foreign policy are all working for us instead of against us. That got shut down big time in the last few years, and it's no surprise that it did, because that does not serve the interest of the elites. But the kind of social justice warrior left versus right thing that we now have going on is great for the people in charge. And so to the extent that we start to see that people start to figure out that the argument should be class-based, and it should not be, skin color or sexual orientation based, then we've got the makings for a coalition that has some possibility of getting things done. And you're seeing this around the world now. Populism, which is basically a political philosophy that says, okay, the masses are being exploited by a tiny minority, and we should go get back from the elites what they've stolen from us. There's nothing beyond that in populism. It's not really a philosophy in terms of tax policy or military policy or anything like that. It's just an attitude. So it tends to lead to chaos, but it also tends to get people elected when social inequality and economic inequality have gotten too extreme, like today. So you're seeing it, in Brexit was one of the first examples of that. And in Germany right now, what used to be the considered the far right party, but is actually a populist party, is now the second most powerful political party. In France, same thing. You've got a very powerful kind of old right that is now gone populist. In Argentina, they elected a guy who sounds like a cross between Ron Paul and Donald Trump, who's extremely populist. And so it goes on and on around the world. People who have the attitude that, we're all together in this, in the sense that a handful of extremely rich people are exploiting us. Let's take care of that, and then we'll work out the other stuff later. That is a winning political platform around the world. And you're seeing it now with the resurgence of Donald Trump and Vivek Ramaswamy, who it sounds like might be on the short list of VP candidates for Trump. And he ran an extremely populist campaign that took him from zero to, national notoriety. And it was all about, hey, we're gonna stop the elites who now run the government from continuing to exploit you. And that sells. It sells everywhere in the world right now. So we're going to see very possibly a populist wave politically in the coming decade. And, on the one hand, that'll be chaotic because populism, then, once it wins, it has to coalesce into an actual set of policies, and nobody agrees on what they should be exactly. But it's going to scare the hell out of the aristocracy. And like you said, they're using the tools of government to suppress dissent right now. And they're meeting a lot of resistance. And it's an interesting battle. But so far, the deep state or the aristocracy or the 1% or whatever you want to call them, they've got the levers of media right now in their hands, with just a very few exceptions. So they're the more powerful party right now, but the opposition is growing. And, I think it's only going to continue to grow as people figure out what's happening. And every time there's another year of double-digit inflation or another recession where the rich companies do really well and the politicians get reelected somehow, even though there was a deep recession, and everybody else takes several steps back on the economic ladder. Whenever those things happen, more and more people become functionally populist, even if they don't describe themselves that way. And so that's unavoidable as debt builds up and inflation accelerates, so we have that happening. And it's just a question of how fast it translates into political opposition. So I think it's happening pretty quickly right now. And this next election is just going to be amazing to watch, I think, in the US.
One of the things that's confusing and spinning this again is the terminology, but it's the control over access to information, and it's the distortion of information, the concentration of power around how information gets. In other words, we used to assume, I remember as a kid, turn on the evening news and there's Walter Cronkite, and at the end he says, and that's the way it is. And you figured, well, Walter Cronkite said so, and that's the way it is. But now it seems that a very large percentage of the population trusts, to some extent, or to a large extent, the information that they get from official media channels. And a lot of those are influenced based on who we've talked to. We've talked to Daniel McAdams from the Ron Paul Institute, and they talk about government being embedded directly in the editorial boards of most major media corporations, as well as on the floor. When I say the editorial function is actually being oversaw, and there's backdoor communication channels, supposedly in the name of combating terrorism or that sort of thing, or foreign interference with our elections, but actually ends up creating new terminology like malinformation. And one of the presidential candidates said they couldn't even contradict anything that I said because it was all true, so they had to call it malinformation, which officially means information that, even though it may be true, is against, will lead people to form opinions that are not favorable to the state or to official agencies and policies, that sort of thing, and that therefore may be dangerous to the public health, etc. Could you expand on that for us about this new 1984 Orwell-esque level that we're rising to, with in the face of this populist tendency globally, where people are taking to the streets and they're trusting their gut and they're standing their ground and that sort of thing. We are still battling ever more sophisticated layers of what's called anti-malinformation influence by government and non-governmental agencies in the name of protecting public health and safety. But it seems to be, when you really peel back the onion, it really seems to be protecting the state itself and the deep state power structures that are in place that you've been describing this whole interview.
Oh yeah, governments are doing everything they can not to ban information per se, but to ban dissent. So anything that opposes their current policies, whether it's on vaccinations or war or name the thing, anybody who dissents from their policies, they get smacked with a label. Like you said, malinformation, misinformation, disinformation. And, we don't even really know what those things mean in the context that they're used out there. But it's basically governments trying to do an end run around the First Amendment in the US and in other countries where they don't have a First Amendment, trying to increase their control over what people can say and do, and what's nice about this is that the pushback is pretty serious. For instance, here's who you want to check out. Besides your show, Dunnigan, your listeners and your viewers should check out Matt Taibbi, Glenn Greenwald, Jimmy Dore, and one more guy. I'll think of his name in a sec. And Michael Schellenberger, and the other guy whose name will come up in a minute. But people like that, Russell Brand, that's who it is, Russell Brand. So people like that are actively pushing back against government censorship, and they're getting away with it, and they're reporting the news accurately. And their audiences are growing exponentially, while the audiences of MSNBC and CNN and even Fox are either not growing or actively shrinking. So, the battle is being won so far. And the question is, what happens when the empire strikes back in a big way here pretty soon? Because what they're going to do is there will be some kind of a false flag crisis. And maybe it'll be a war they engineer. Maybe it'll be the next pandemic, illness X or something like that is what they're talking about out there. Like they're softening us up for the next thing. Or there could be a cyber attack. There's all kinds of things that could happen. And or the aliens could land on the White House lawn, They're lining us up and softening us up for lots of different possibilities. And they're going to use that crisis, whatever it is, to totally clamp down on alternative voices and dissenting voices. And that's coming. So what we need to do now is get as educated as possible and find the platforms that have the best chance of surviving. Right now, Rumble is doing great out there. Substack, you know that you're doing well when they start calling you a hotbed of neo-Nazis. And that's what they say about Rumble and Substack right now. And they have to jump through so many hoops to get to that point. Like they have to find, some podcast where they had 17 viewers that said something fascist or something like that, and that nobody watched or anything, but it just appeared on the platform. But they're willing to do it because they can so far get away with it. And so that is a battle that's coming. And, you can see them setting up for it because the Middle East right now is one stupid mistake on the part of a jet fighter pilot or a ship's captain or, anybody else in charge of any kind of weapons over there. From a broad-based Middle East war that might involve Russia, might involve China, will definitely pull the U.S. in. And, it wouldn't be a surprise at all if that's part of the plan, where we're planning to use Israel as a proxy army against Iran, the same way we used Ukraine as a proxy army against Russia. And that might be a big enough crisis to let them kind of sort of declare information martial law and start shutting everybody down. We'll see. But we should be prepared for that, because it's totally consistent with what government has done over the past 20 years. And there's no reason for them to stop now because nothing has happened that would give them the idea that the next one won't work as well as the last one. So anyhow, fascinating times we live in, and it's only going to get more intense.
Before we got started, you and I were talking about the phenomenon of cryptocurrencies and adoption, and now Bitcoin, exchange traded funds, ETFs coming out, and how it's sometimes necessary for boomer generations to enlist someone of the millennial or younger generations to help them because the technological hurdles seem baffling. And I want to get to that in a minute, but I want to make an analogy to this topic that we're talking about right here, and that is this idea that democratization of information access, which we thought the internet was going to bring. We thought, well, even if for generations we've had concentration of power, we went from thousands and thousands of independent newspapers and radio stations in the United States just to a handful of few corporations and families that were controlling all of the major media outlets, etc. So we've had this absolute concentration of power in the access to information. And so the hope that the internet was going to provide us with ubiquitous access to all kinds of different opinions and information so we could really share that with each other has been challenged by the fact that it's been not only clamped down on or name called or shadow banned or page ranked, so that it may be out there. It's not outright banned, but it's just you can't find it. It's not going to come up in search results, so ordinary people won't find it, etc. Some people, such as Catherine Austin Fitts, the founder of the Solari Report, has printed hard copy books. Epoch Times is putting out hard copy newspapers and sending them out. What is your thought about using? Speaking of pitchforks, it's going back to tried and true older technology that may not be as subject to this centralized choke points as the internet is.
It might come to that. The revolutionaries in the 1700s made their points with anonymous pamphlets. And it could be that, and then the dissenting voices in the 1920s and 30s had all these newspapers that they sold on the street, and passed around and everything, even though they were, technically in some cases illegal, but they did it and got away with it. Well, could be the same thing. I hope not. It would be better if the dissenters just took the internet back over. So let's hope for that first, that we gain at least a foothold or hold a foothold in digital technology, and we're able to speak freely as we kind of are today. It's not a desert out there. It's not a lost battle, because we've still got Rumble and we've still got Twitter, and we've still got Substack and a few other sites. So let those guys expand instead of being throttled, and we've got a pretty strong voice out there. So that would be the ideal way for it to work out. But if it has to be paper, so be it. I think we have to do whatever we have to do.
Let's not let that moment slip away. John, you've recently started a Substack channel. Let people know how they can find you there so that they can subscribe, and I'll make sure people know how they can make sure they're on our mailing list as well.
Okay, it's rubino.substack.com. And mostly what I cover there is we don't spend a lot of time on the stuff that you and I talked about today. It's more, how do you invest for a crisis, or what kind of lifestyle do you adopt? In other words, prepping in anticipation of some of the stuff that you and I talked about today. So it's mostly actionable stuff. But there's a big chunk of it that's free, with the actionable stuff behind a paywall, but lots of free stuff. So far so good. It's 1 year old, and the community there has grown dramatically and gotten really interesting.
I've always been impressed with the breadth and depth of the topics that you address there. So I think people will find a rich resource base there to draw on. Grateful for that. Is it rubino.substack.com? Okay. And folks, if you want to make sure you don't miss a single episode with John Rubino here on Liberty and Finance, or any of our guests, make sure you get on our free mailing list, and we don't share your email address with anyone. Just go to libertyandfinance.com, put in your name, your email address, click submit, and then make sure that you confirm on the confirming email, and you'll get one email in your inbox per day with our latest interviews and any specials. Okay, so now turning to that topic of sort of decentralized democratization of alternative currencies, that kind of thing. We've been in a stranglehold with these Keynesians, the crazy people running the asylum, or the fox guarding the hen house, or whatever metaphor you want to use as far as the destruction of our currency and our financial futures. One remedy that people have discovered for that is going back to tried and true holding real assets, owning real commodities, or owning precious metals as a store of value, as an offline, off-grid savings account that's outside the banking system, outside the dollar destruction, etc. That's been tried and true through millennia and across all regimes around the world. But another new alternative to that is cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin is the undisputed leader in that regards. And just in the last week or two, a bunch of Bitcoin-based exchange-traded funds, ETFs, were launched. Some of them were like the Grayscale one was there before, but some of them are new. And can you let people know if you think that this is a significant development, or why people should be aware of that?
It's a potentially big deal, because it's, the process is basically the mainstreaming of Bitcoin. And in its fairly brief life, it's mostly been an asset you could buy and store and speculate in. It hasn't been money. I mean, the original design was for a form of digital money that is out of the control of governments and trades freely around the world, which I love the concept of it. And we haven't reached the point where that's true yet. You can't go to Costco and use Bitcoin. You don't see anything priced in Bitcoin yet, really. But one of the steps along the road to Bitcoin being something like money is ETFs, where you can just buy them with a mouse click, instead of having to jump through the technical hoops that boomers are so resistant to when it comes to stuff like Bitcoin. And the question is, with this new batch of ETFs that just came out, by the way, they're very popular. They're generating a lot of trading activity right now. But the question is, are they the equivalent of a physical commodity ETF, where somebody goes out and buys a bunch of gold, puts it in a vault, and then if you buy the ETF, you, at least in theory, own some of that gold. And people are telling me that no, most of these ETFs are actually financial instruments that use futures contracts to replicate the movement of Bitcoin. And in that case, it's it's arguable that it's not a good thing for adoption of Bitcoin as money. And we'll have to see how it goes. And so far, Bitcoin did a buy on the rumor, sell on the news kind of thing, where it spiked in anticipation of these ETFs coming out, and then it went back down. It's given back a lot of its recent gains, and that's, I guess, arguably to have been expected. So that's the way things trade a lot of the time. But we'll see what kind of an impact in the long run these ETFs have on Bitcoin, because if they're just financial instruments that use futures contracts, then they don't really increase the demand for Bitcoin. But to the extent that any of them are physical storage, where you take Bitcoin off the market, put it in a safe place, and that raises the price via increased scarcity, then it's a good thing for Bitcoin's price and its legitimacy in the monetary system. So we'll see how it goes. I don't know enough about it to say it's one or the other right now, but we'll find out. That's going to be the subject of a lot of stories going forward. So we'll be able to talk about it as it unfolds.
That principle that you are outlining there is critical, though, and that is the distinction between purchasing something that is supposed to give you participation in price action, which in other words is just a trading or speculating mechanism, rather than something that you actually own. What do you have legal title to, and what do you legally own? That's something that's absolutely critical. Back to our earlier discussion about the Great Taking and all things related, the Dodd-Frank Act, etc., is like when the chips fall down, when the house of cards come tumbling down, what are you left actually owning? We've interviewed Australian economist John Adams about this. He says people be very, very careful if you're buying such like ETFs regarding silver or gold, like SLV or GLD, that you do not have legal title to metals. You can't just show up and say, I'd like to pick up my metals tomorrow, thank you. And those who have tried, Rafi Farber is one, have been taken on a wild and interesting ride for months and months, filling out form after form and appeal after appeal and everything, and gotten nowhere. So be very, very aware of that. Tomorrow we're going to be interviewing constitutional attorney Dr. Edmund Vieira on this topic of private property rights. There's lots of concerns around private property rights. There's civil asset forfeiture. There's farmers' land who's being taken away, on and on and on, all over the place. It's one of the major trends that's happening in this lovely future that's being planned for us of you will own nothing. And it's something we need to be very aware of so that we can intelligently position ourselves to not be taken advantage of as part of that. So any thoughts that you have before we wrap on this idea of private property rights and what do you really own?
That might be the big question of the next decade, Dunnigan, because what we own, we really, really need to know that we actually own it, right? In this kind of a world, because anything else can be stolen from you. So what is the definition of really, really owning something? And that's something we're going to have to work out. I'm going to be really interested in the interview you just mentioned, because that's something at the margin. I understand that I own my house if it's paid for and has no encumbrances in its past or anything. I understand I own my car. I understand I own my gold and silver and a few other things. But then there's this gray area, do you own the gold that's in a physical ETF, even if the ETF has the correct rules and everything so that it's allocated storage, yada, yada. Do you own that? Well, we need to find out. And that is going to be the thing that guides our asset allocation going forward. In other words, how much can you safely have in financial accounts? And I think it's okay to have some now, because the Great Taking is not a done deal. Like, it's not a guaranteed thing. It's just one more data point out there that is possible. So I still have bank accounts. I still have brokerage accounts. But I'm wondering if I should shrink them dramatically and convert a lot of that capital into just flat out physical accounts, the safest things that are possible to have, and what those things would be in the world going forward. So this is still a big thought process, and it's still ongoing, and it's something we should all be doing. And it's something you can help a lot by having experts on to tell the rest of us exactly what we should be doing in this new legal framework to make sure that we actually own what we think we own.
Yeah, and a big portion of that, for example, you mentioned I own my home. A lot of us would like to think that as well. We've had ranchers whose family have been ranching land for 3 or 5 generations are now being told, you're going to have to move off of this because now this is going to be protected federal land. In fact, the Biden administration just put out an executive order number 14008 entitled Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. And on page 9, section 216, it talks about targeting that by 2030, 30% of the land in the U.S. should be federally owned and protected, and by 2050, 50%. So we have to be very aware of that. We're going to be talking more about that because a lot of assumptions that people have made, and also people have made the quip that if you think you own your home, try taking a break from paying your county property tax and see how long it takes to be invited to leave by the sheriff. But anyway, there's a very vigorous discussion we need to have about that because with all of this concern surfacing about you will own nothing and be happy, people are understandably very interested in knowing how they can ensure their ownership for themselves, for their children and grandchildren of things that are real, and that we can actually have make a life plan that actually isn't being dismantled by those who are changing the rules as we go along. So it'll be an interesting journey. John, I think you've had your eyes on this longer than most people with your former site. The dollarcollapse.com was aptly named for, quite some time ago. So you've been watching this more closely than most. And folks, you really need to check out John's Substack account, rubino.substack.com, and take advantage of that as well. John, thank you for joining us again here on Liberty and Finance.
Thanks, Deligan. Talk to you soon.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for January 22nd through January 29th, 2024 while supplies last. First, we feature pre-1933 gold $10 and $20 Liberties at $89 over melt and $139 over melt, respectively. Next, backdated 1-ounce silver maples are at $3.75 over spot with a minimum order of 50. We also have backdated quarter-ounce gold maples at $59 over melt when you purchase 2 or more. And finally, backdated 1/10-ounce gold maples are just $32.50 over melt with your purchase of 4 or more coins. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.